As a result of the victory of the Khmer Rouge over the governmental forces in 1975, the radical communists established a brutal dictatorship across the country. The events that followed would find their way into the history books as one of the most violent genocides to have ever occurred. Born to a prosperous farmer, Pol Pot was educated at one of the elite schools in Cambodia. While staying in Paris in 1940, he joined the French Communist Party. Returning to Cambodia in 1953, he then joined the Khmer Viet Minh, the predecessors to the Khmer Rouge, in the fight against the King of Cambodia. He founded the Communist Party of Kampuchea in 1959, but had to hide in the jungle to avoid state pushback. In 1965, he flew to Beijing to meet officials of the CCP. Later, Beijing supplied his war efforts generously with over $1 billion of funding. It was only in 1968 that Pol Pot eventually relaunched the war alongside Vietnam. With his allies, he overthrew the government and established his rule in 1975. The highest priority of the government was to establish an agricultural society. Their goal was to achieve 70% to 80% farm mechanization within 5 to 10 years and a modern industrial base within 15 to 20 years. As part of this project, Pol Pot saw it as imperative that they develop means of ensuring that the farming population worked harder than ever before. At the September plenum, Pol Pot announced that all farmers were now expected to meet a quota of 3 tons of paddy or unmilled rice per hectare, an increase on what was previously the expected yield. Although a new Cambodian currency had been printed in China during the Civil War, the Khmer Rouge decided not to introduce it. They believed that the new currency would only lead to corruption and undermine their efforts to establish a socialist society. Thus, for a time, there were no wages in democratic Kampuchea. The population was expected to do whatever the Khmer Rouge commanded of them without pay. If they refused, they faced punishment, sometimes even execution. For this reason, Pol Pot's Cambodia was seen as a slave state, with its people effectively forced into slavery by working without pay. The new standing committee decreed that the population would work 10-day weeks with 1 day off. From 1975 on, all those living in rural areas, meaning the vast majority of Cambodia's population, were reclassified as members of one of 3 groups: full rights members, candidates, or the depositees, the lowest class which held basically no rights. The Khmer Rouge militia regularly killed those they deemed to be bad elements. A common proclamation utilized by the Khmer Rouge for those to be executed was that, to keep you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss. Bodies were often buried by fields in order to act as fertilizer. During the first year under Khmer Rouge rule, most areas around the country were able to stave off starvation despite significant population increases caused by the deposited cities being evacuated. Measures were taken to indoctrinate those living in the cooperatives with common phrases about hard work and loving Cambodia. Cambodians were encouraged to talk about themselves in the plural we rather than the singular I. While working the fields, people were typically segregated by sex. Sport was prohibited. The only reading material that people were permitted to read was produced by the government. Restrictions were placed on movement, with people allowed to travel only with the permission of the local authorities. The Constitution asserted state ownership by the means of production, declared the equality of men and women, and the right and obligation of all citizens to work. Pol Pot described the new state as a precious model for humanity, with a revolutionary spirit that outstripped that of earlier revolutionary socialist movements. Despite their Marxist pretenses, the Khmer Rouge sought to eradicate the working class, viewing it as a decadent relic of the past. Several villages were linked to form a single cooperative of between 500 to 1,000 families. Communal kitchens were also introduced, so that all members of a commune ate together rather than in their homes. Foraging or hunting for additional food was prohibited. Starting in the summer of 1976, the government ordered that any child over the age of 7 would not live with their parents, but instead communally with Khmer Rouge instructors. The Khmer Rouge also classified people based on their religious and ethnic backgrounds. Under the leadership of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge had a policy of state atheism. Buddhist monks were viewed as social parasites and designated a special class. The killing fields are a number of sites in Cambodia where, collectively, more than 1 million people were killed and buried. Analysis of 20,000 mass grave sites indicates at least 1,386,734 victims of execution. Estimates of the total death toll resulting from Khmer Rouge policies, including death from disease and starvation, range from 1.7 to 2.5 million, out of a population of roughly 8 million in 1975. The Khmer Rouge regime arrested and eventually executed almost everyone suspected of having connections with the former Cambodian government or with foreign governments as well as professionals and intellectuals. Ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Thai, ethnic Chinese, ethnic Cham, Cambodian Christians, and Buddhist monks were additional demographic targets of persecution. The judicial process of the Khmer Rouge regime for minor or political crimes began with a warning from the regime. People who had received more than 2 warnings were sent for re-education, which meant near certain death. People were often encouraged to confess their pre-revolutionary lifestyles in crimes, implying free market activity or contact with foreigners. These individuals were then taken away for torture or execution. To save ammunition, executions were often carried out using poison, spades, sharpened bamboo sticks, bayonets, knives, wooden clubs, hoes for farming, and curved scythes. In some cases, the children and infants of adult victims were killed by having their heads bashed against the trunks of chankiri trees before being thrown into the pits alongside their parents. The rationale was to stop them growing up and taking revenge for their parents' deaths. In September 1976, various party members were arrested and accused of conspiring with Vietnam to overthrow Pol Pot's government. These party members were accused of being spies for either the CIA, the Soviet KGB, or the Vietnamese. They were encouraged to confess to the accusations, often after torture, with these confessions then being read out at party meetings. The Khmer Rouge converted a disused secondary school in Phnom Penh's Tuol Sleng region into a security prison, S21. By the spring of 1977, 1,000 people were being sent there month after month. Eventually, between 15,000 and 20,000 people would be killed at S21. Across the country, peasant cadres tortured and killed members of their communities whom they disliked. Many cadres ate the livers of their victims and tore unborn fetuses from their mothers for use as kun crack talismans. By August 1977, between 4,000 and 5,000 party members had been neutralized. In 1978, the government initiated a second purge, during which tens of thousands of Cambodians were accused of being Vietnamese sympathizers and murdered. Renewed border clashes between Vietnam and Cambodia reappeared in 1977. The failure of the Eastern Zone to withstand the initial Vietnamese invasion made Pol Pot suspicious, and he ordered a purge of their ranks. Aware that they would be killed on Pol Pot's orders, increasing numbers of Eastern Zone troops began rebelling against the Khmer Rouge government. Pol Pot sent more troops into the Eastern Zone to defeat the rebels, ordering them to slaughter the inhabitants of any villages that were believed to be harboring rebel forces. Fleeing the government troops, many leading rebels, including future high-ranking politicians, made it into Vietnam, where they joined the anti-Pol Pot exile community. On the 25th of December 1978, the Vietnamese army launched its full-scale invasion. Within just 2 weeks, Phnom Penh was captured. The remaining party members, including Pol Pot, fled into the jungle where they regrouped and adapted guerrilla warfare for almost the next 2 decades. Attempts to regain political power failed due to general unpopularity, clashes, and infighting. Pol Pot's health was also declining. He suffered from aortic stenosis and no longer had access to follow-up treatment for his earlier cancer. A stroke left him paralyzed on the left side of his body. The division among the Khmer eventually caused a comrade to imprison him for betrayal. On the 15th of April 1998, Pol Pot died of heart failure in his sleep. The Khmer Rouge themselves continued to face territorial losses to the Cambodian army, and, in March 1999, the last high-ranking member was also captured, thus closing this dark chapter of Cambodian history.